As Venom 2 races toward theaters, there's really only one question on everyone's mind. Will Tom Hardy still be super sweaty in the sequel? And the other big question is whether Tom Holland's Spider-Man will make an appearance in the film. There's only been hints and teases that the webhead will show up, but it's clear that everyone involved wants to make that happen. And because Eddie Brock is about to face one of the most dangerous comic book villains ever, a Spider-Man and Venom team-up makes sense. Today we're talking about the potential Spider-Man and Venom team-up, so let's get into it right now. Although Eddie Brock and his BFF symbiote faced a pretty tough challenge and riot at the end of the first movie, we all knew there was a bigger threat out there. Because you can't really set up a Venom franchise without eventually getting to his greatest nemesis. The destructive force of evil known as Carnage is one of the worst villains in all of comics history. And thanks to a tease at the end of Venom, we know he'll be back to cause trouble in the sequel, while looking a lot like Woody Harrelson. Just describing Carnage should be enough to give you nightmares. In the comics, the crazy serial killer known as Cletus Kasady was cellmates with Eddie Brock. Once the Venom symbiote came to break Eddie out, a piece of it was left behind and merged with Cletus. Now, in the comics, Eddie Brock wasn't the greatest guy, but he was a straight-up saint compared to Cletus Kasady. The wicked and vile things Cletus did are too graphic to describe in this video, but just believe us when we say that you don't want to run into him in a dark alleyway, or in a well-lit alleyway for that matter. He's a sociopathic, homicidal sadist who's probably really just mad because his name is Cletus. Now, since the live-action version of the movie sees Eddie Brock as more of a good guy than his comic book counterpart started out as, we don't expect the sequel to follow Carnage's origin story verbatim. Instead, it seems like Cletus is already fascinated with Eddie Brock as he's locked up, and it doesn't take a rocket scientist to know that he probably won't stay locked up for long come the next movie. In terms of powers, Venom needs to watch out. Carnage is stronger than the anti-hero while also being able to shapeshift and use the symbiote to create a whole range of deadly weapons. There have been some versions out of the comics where Carnage can suck the life out of people by touching them, and for Venom's sake, we hope that's not carried over. And even with all this awesome power, the bad guy side gets even more stacked for the sequel, as it's been confirmed that Naomi Harris will be playing Shriek, a powerful supervillain who in the comics is Carnage's love interest. Talk about unfair, right? It's almost like Venom will need to team up with someone in order to take down the pair of baddies, right? Well, who could that be? If you ask us, we sort of have the perfect candidate. Alright, full disclosure, we just want Tom Holland to be a major part of the Venom sequel, just so there would be two main actors named Tom. Can you imagine it? Director Andy Serkis would yell out, "Tom, I need you to act scarier," and both Tom Hardy and Tom Holland would look confused at one another, not knowing what to do. Classic comedy. Alright, fine, there might be better reasons to have Spider-Man be a part of Venom 2. For one thing, the Venom and Spider-Man relationship is just so great, and a partnership between the two deserves a proper team-up. And we are just dying to see how exactly a meeting between Tom Holland's Peter Parker and Tom Hardy's Eddie Brock would unfold. In the comics, Peter and Eddie are rival journalists, and Peter exposes him as a fraud. This, of course, leads Eddie down the path to merge with the symbiote that was originally attached to Spider-Man. Eddie, Peter, and the symbiote are forever linked to one another, and that's why comics Venom looks a lot like Spider-Man, except with more black and a lot of teeth. We have to admit, as cool as Venom looked on the big screen, it was weird seeing the character without the white spider on his chest. So since they changed Eddie's original origin story in his solo film, it creates a much more interesting dynamic for the two characters going forward. How would a meeting between Peter Parker and Eddie Brock work, given what we know about each character? Well, although Peter hasn't expressed much of an interest in journalism or photography, we know he's eventually on a path to become a photographer for the Daily Bugle, where he spends his days taking pictures of Spider-Man for the Spider-Man picture fanatic J. Jonah Jameson. Now, who knows? Maybe because they've already changed so much of Peter's normal comic arc, they won't have him become a photographer out in the real world. But if they did want to follow that, maybe a chance encounter with rockstar journalist Eddie Brock would help nudge Peter in the right direction. It would definitely put a unique spin on the complex relationship the two usually have in the comics, because now a relatively younger Spider-Man has a chance to learn from the rugged and crusading anti-hero Eddie Brock. Talk about strange. But it's something that we are just dying to see in live action. And just look at all the school trips Peter's school goes on. They go to Washington, D.C. in Spider-Man Homecoming, and then Europe in Spider-Man Far From Home. And sure, it was revealed that Nick Fury was really the one orchestrating the class trip in a foreign country, which makes more sense, but the point still remains that these high school students get to travel a lot more than we ever did in high school. So what, you get dusted one time by Thanos, and then that magically grants these kids the right to travel around the world? We're not upset or anything, all we're saying is a quick trip to San Francisco wouldn't be out of the question. And who knows, maybe if it takes place in the same multiverse, Spider-Man can go to San Fran looking for Ant-Man. Or if they continue the narrative of Far From Home, maybe Spider-Man fled to San Francisco to hide out from the cops and clear his head a little bit to figure out what he's going to do about being framed for the whole Mysterio debacle. But why would these two need to team up anyway? Well, as mentioned, Carnage and Shriek will prove to be a frightening pair that Venom probably can't handle alone. Sure, we know Eddie has a great ally in Anne Weying, as evidenced by her awesome move of taking the symbiote and biting off some random goon's head with it, but if the symbiote sticks to Eddie, that leaves Anne without any powers. So it would be better to team up with someone who doesn't need a symbiote to function. But having said that, there would be something cool about having Anne Weying battling Shriek while Venom and Spider-Man team up to take on Carnage. Can't you just see Venom, Spider-Man, and Carnage all going at each other, zipping around, flinging different colored goo at one another? It would be great! On top of that, you have to look at the impact of what teaming up with Spider-Man would do for the Venom character overall. If he starts the movie reluctant to team up with anyone and is dedicated to going about things alone without help, but somehow Spider-Man convinces him to change his mind and work together at the end, that puts Eddie in the best position going forward in this young Sonyverse. Now he's more willing to team up or search for other special anti-heroes like him, and the obvious villain team-up Sony is clearly working toward can finally begin with Venom as its lead. And that's all thanks to Spider-Man. Eddie Brock is currently towing the line between anti-hero and hero, and we think both Spider-Man and Venom can learn from one another. Spider-Man can realize that sometimes you gotta break the rules if you want to fight for what's right, which is perfect and could inspire him to go back to New York to clear his name, while Venom can learn more about being a straight-up hero who needs to have a code of honor. The best team-ups are the ones where each character learns something from one another, and given where each character is at right now, the time is perfect for a team-up between the two comic icons. And it makes sense too. Not just because Carnage is so powerful, but because it both works on a story and a greater Sonyverse level. It certainly makes everything we heard from behind the scenes even more interesting. So overall, how likely is this to happen? Well, although there's been no direct confirmation, the powers in charge all seem to want to make it happen. Original Venom director Ruben Fleischer has said before that a Spider-Man and Venom crossover movie will definitely happen. And although he's handed over the reins of the franchise to Andy Serkis, we still believe that Venom and Spider-Man will meet up face to face in the sequel. And Fleischer wasn't the only creative mind teasing this epic confrontation. The writer of the first movie, Jeff Pinker, has also hinted at a Venom and Spider-Man team-up during an interview with Discussing Film. Clearly, the Venom side all want to find space for Spider-Man, and due to all the drama with the MCU, we feel now more than ever he's going to make an appearance in the Sonyverse. Just a little while ago, fans were shocked to hear about the Sony and Disney spat that ended with Spider-Man being removed from the MCU. Dark days indeed. It was almost unbelievable, but after about a month, the two companies seemed to smooth things over, and the webhead was allowed to remain in the MCU for one more solo film and an additional team-up movie. But it was Kevin Feige's comments that were really interesting. He seemed to tease that Spider-Man would be appearing in both the MCU and the relatively young Sonyverse. Maybe one of the stipulations Sony was able to work out with Disney was that Spider-Man could return to the MCU, but only if he could also make an appearance in Venom 2. If that's the case, then Sony did a great job negotiating. Spider-Man's future with the MCU is the biggest question mark. We know that he'll be in it for at least a little while longer to complete his character arc, because we'd really be living in an unjust world if the cliffhanger from Spider-Man Far From Home was never properly resolved. But after that's done, we see Sony wanting to bring the character over full-time into their universe. Before that can officially happen, Sony needs to prove that Spider-Man can fit in their villain world they're building. So having Peter Parker show up briefly in Venom 2 to help fight Carnage would not only be a major boost to Venom in general, but also test the waters in seeing how the character functions with their own characters. Think of it like a trial run, but a really awesome one that would make fans' heads explode. Overall, it's just too good an opportunity to pass up. That's why we think Venom and Spider-Man are definitely meeting in the sequel. We hope that Spider-Man and Venom team up in the Venom sequel. Just listening to everyone talking about it makes it seem like an inevitability, so let's start now. Do you want to see it happen? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more awesome comic book content, and as always, thanks for watching.